Just a quick walkthrough on some of the modern video connectors that are available for PCs. I've gotten a lot of questions about, can I do this over HDMI? What is Displayport? Can I do X using an adapter? So it seemed appropriate that our first just technical informational video be about that. And I'm going to mention a couple of other connectors that I'm not really going to spend a ton of time talking about because they're either just for historical framing or they are outside of the realm of consumer video. So some of your earlier computer video standards were things like composite, you had S-video, you had RF connectors, and those were really TV standards. That was just computers adopting things that already existed. And it wasn't until 1987 we got one that you still see today, and that is good old VGA, Video Graphics Array. And this has been around for a long time, and you still see it on new monitors today in 2020. Not many, usually monitors that have VGA or lower-end panels. But VGA has come a long way from the 80 column or 320 by 240 resolutions that it had when you started off. It has been adapted and scaled up, and you can push 1080p over a VGA cable. You don't want to, though. You can actually push resolutions above 1080p. I had a 19-inch CRT that ran at was it 2048 by 1536. So real sharp, clear picture with one terrible flaw. VGA is an analog signal. It's actually the only analog connector that's still in common use on monitors. You do see some of the other ones, those RCA connectors that are used for things like composite or component video available on televisions. Usually that's for like older game consoles, DVD players, that type of stuff. But on computer panels, you generally see VGA, and that's the only analog connector you see. And of course, there's exceptions to that rule. But VGA is susceptible to interference. So if I am running a 60 hertz signal through this VGA cable here in the US, and it is next to a 60 hertz power cord, even if it's the power cord for the monitor itself, I'm going to get interference through that cable. So I've seen this before, especially when multi-monitored arrays were taking off, and you'd get, one digital and one analog, and then the built-in on a laptop. This was around 2012. I was seeing this a bit earlier than that as well. And if these ran next to a power line, you'd see this vertical line slowly go through the screen, or you'd see it kind of jiggle and wave and all sorts of odd artifacts, even on flat panels, because it was getting weird stuff through the VGA cable. Now there are solutions to that. The cable can be made thicker, you can have better separation on the conductors in there, you can have shielding in the cable. None of that beats the simple solution of going to a digital interface. And the first digital interface that we had was introduced, well, there were a couple before this. Those were Pro Video. We had SD-SDI and ED-SDI, but we got DVI. This thing, and this is actually an excellent DVI cable to have as an example piece. So we can see that it's a little bit bigger than VGA. That's actually one of the downsides for DVI. And you can see my particular DVI cable here is actually missing a section of pins in the center. That's because this is what's called a single link DVI cable. And basically this connector is capable of carrying 1080p video. And that's it. DVI will carry 1080p video. Now, dual link DVI, which adds those other pins in, is capable of handling 2560 by 1600. And I actually have, this is Displayport, but we'll get to it in a second, a dual link DVI adapter. So you can do 2560 by 1600 through a dual link cable, or 1080 through a single link cable. And this is a big connector, but it was digital and it was better than VGA, and that was what it was good at. And you still occasionally see this on low-end video cards and low to mid-range monitors today. You're not going to get high refresh rates through it, but you can do 1080. The GTX 1650s that we looked at a couple of months ago had DVI on them, because as a budget video card, the idea that I might be reusing one or two old monitors that still rely on DVI isn't particularly far-fetched. Now, DVI did have a neat trick in that you'll notice that this is a single flat connector there. And if I grab this one, you'll notice that this adapter has additional pins around that, although it doesn't have the full complement of what DVI is capable of. The DVI connector also is capable of carrying analog signals. Almost any DVI device you buy that still has those analog pins present, so like the 1650s didn't, but if you got a 1050 or a 960, I think the 1050 did, I know the 950s did, you would get an adapter like this to hook up VGA. VGA made it in video cards all the way almost to the most recent generation of cards. So this was just one more trick that DVI could do. So DVI was around for a little while, and then it kind of fell out of favor pretty quickly. And what happened to DVI was in 2002, HDMI 1.0 was introduced. And we didn't see HDMI adopted for a little while, but what really drove this was, this is not a consumer connection for things like AV. You don't want a TV with one of these. And it's lacking features that you want on a TV. There's no audio that goes through DVI. So HDMI came around. This connector, this is the HDMI connector. And really, this was kind of top of the line unless you had monitors that were bigger than 1080, which in 2002 wasn't a huge concern. So HDMI 1, HDMI 1.2, 1.3 didn't really do resolutions above 1080p. It wasn't until HDMI 1.2a that you could get 2560 by 1440 through this cable, and it was only at 30 frames a second. And that was a 2005 addition to the standard. And it was around 2005 that just DVI kind of run its course. There were no updates to DVI itself, and it was going to go the way of the dodo, as it were. So the next few additions to HDMI really focused on shoring up what it could do in the video world, and part of that came from HDMI had competition. So HDMI was great in that it was completely backwards compatible with DVI. You can get HDMI to DVI adapters that just look like this. They're basic plugs. But in 2006, which would have been HDMI 1.3, same thing, we got two additional standards. We got 3G SDI, which is a pro standard, and you tend to see that on professional cameras and other audio video gear. We also got, and I'm probably going to ramble about this one a little bit because it's really what you should be using for your computer, Displayport. So Displayport showed up and basically said, anything you can do, I can do better. So Displayport 1.0, Displayport 1.1 were released between the time HDMI 1.3 and 1.4 were released. And that's where things really get... Alright, so our first generation of Displayport, 1.0 through 1.1a, which was quickly iterated on, and I don't actually remember seeing any 1.0 devices, would have been contemporary to HDMI 1.3 and 1.3a. So between these two, we've got a couple of things that HDMI was still better at for that first generation. Everybody's got 16-bit per pixel color depth support. HDMI does support a couple of additional color spaces that Displayport doesn't have, including sRGB, which is pretty important for computers. But there is one thing that Displayport introduced that they really used this to their advantage and hammered forward with it, is that Displayport was not a single data link. Displayport was a quad lane device. So early on, 10 gigs of data through Displayport 1.1a, which translated to 8.64 after encoding, versus 1.3, roughly the same 8 gigs a second for the transmission capacity. And that played out as far as resolution support was concerned, that 1.3 was capable of 4K. You could do 4K 30 with this 1.3. You could do 2560 by 1440 at 60 hertz. That was what HDMI really needed to take over where DVI was good at things. And Displayport showed up, and they have this HBR mode, which for Displayport 1 got you all the way to 4K 30, just like HDMI. Now, things got really interesting when Displayport 1.2 came around. That's 2010, 2012 for 1.2 and 1.2a. At the same time, we have HDMI 1.4 showing up. HDMI 1.4 is where we get 4K 30, so that's good. Displayport, on the other hand, introduces this new HBR2, which is an additional high bandwidth method, brings support all the way for Adobe RGB, DCI-P3, simplified color profiles, basically everything but Rec 2020, which hadn't even been considered yet. And then HDMI picks those up as well in 1.4. But that HBR2 allows, so that HDR2 allows Displayport to go all the way up, that HBR2 allows Displayport to go all the way up to 5K 30. Now, that sounds kind of weird. 4K 75 is probably a little more popular, but 5K 30 is above and beyond anything that HDMI can handle for this generation. HDMI can do 5K if we introduce chroma subsampling. And you'll notice on the chart that comes up for Displayport, there's all these notes about DSC and 442 and 420 color spaces, because technically using HBR2 for a 1.3 link, you can go all the way to 8K 60 as long as you're willing to let it run with display stream compression. So, and this was a trend that carried on for a while. DisplayPort 1.4 is actually the one that you'll find in most devices today. And that was introduced in 2016, just before HDMI 2.1 shows up in 2017. And what I mean by most devices today is that if you look at your video cards, your GTX 680, back in 2012 was DisplayPort 1.2 and HDMI 1.4a. Well, a GTX 980 was HDMI 2.0 and DisplayPort 1.4. And DisplayPort 1.2. Come around to a more modern card, like your 1080s, your 2080s, DisplayPort 1.4 and HDMI 2.0b. Now, this is just the device. This isn't necessarily your TVs and your monitors. A monitor has to support HDMI 2 or DisplayPort 1.4 to be capable of receiving the signals. Otherwise, the video card's going to bring it down to whatever standard the monitor says it can take. So if we look at DisplayPort 1.4 against HDMI 2.0B, which is really a lot of the devices we've looked at lately. Things like that VOTech panel, things like those 1650s. These are the Connect versions that they have. Using DisplayPort 1.4, well, I get HBR3, which means as long as I'm willing to play with display stream compression or chroma subsampling, I can go all the way up to 8K 144. And if I'm not willing to play with those, I can still do 8K 30 or 5K 60 or 4K 120. That's pretty awesome to do on 1.4. On the HDMI side, we can do for that 2.0B, we can do 4K 60, we can do chroma subsampling to handle 4K 75 or 120, we can do 5K 30 or chroma subsampling for 5K 60 or 8K 30. So the net result of this is that when you see big professional monitors, something like a ProArt, or when you see really high-end gaming panels, they adopted DisplayPort very quickly because DisplayPort let them push the limits of what the video cards were capable of. I mean, HDMI 2.1 now does finally support 8K video without any compression, and did finally introduce display stream compression. This is a back and forth game. So obviously both of these standards are looking at each other and trying to compete. Now, one thing that DisplayPort has that HDMI doesn't is this thing. So this is a DisplayPort 1.2 multi-stream hub. So this is a 1.2 device, which means that I'm really not going to push 4K through it if I want any reasonable frame rate, because we're talking 1.2 is HBR2. I mean, I guess I could do 4K 60 through it, but multi-stream generally I've seen work best at like 1080 or 2560 by 1440. And what this does is it allows DisplayPort to take those lanes and chain out additional panels from a single cable. Now, this particular one, this is a hub that we reviewed a while ago, isn't going to get you anything from a cable management perspective. It's going to let you plug 2 monitors into your laptop, and I assume Excel has a more recent version that uses DisplayPort 1.4 at this point. But panels, especially high-end professional panels, my Dell UltraSharp panels on my desk, I can connect those to my PC with a single cable because I can use DisplayPort Multistream to send video from one panel to the second. So that can neaten things up, and I've seen some panels support chaining up to 3 panels, even at 4K, with high enough end panels. Obviously, you have to have the appropriate DisplayPort revision for that. So we're talking 1.4 there to do HBR3, and we're probably talking about getting 4K 30 by the time you've done 2 panels. So that's one thing that DisplayPort's just kind of adopted, and HDMI never really had a reason to. HDMI's domain is televisions. And some semi-pro and even professional video cameras. So, like my Zcam E1 here has mini HDMI out. Which would be this size connector. And I've seen some tablets and things like that will have micro HDMI, which is smaller still. Although these are both VGA dongles. So what else is there? Active adapters. You'll see a lot of video cards today shipping with almost entirely Displayport configurations. And a lot of that comes from what I mentioned here, where, you know, that even Displayport 1.4, which isn't actually the most recent version, can do things that are just showing up in HDMI 2.0. And that's nothing to say of Displayport 2.0, which I fully expect to see in the next generation of video cards. Is capable of being adapted to just about anything. You can get Displayport dongles all the way to VGA or DVI, although this is a mini Displayport, and HDMI. Now the thing to keep in mind with both DVI and HDMI is the Displayport is actually capable of carrying a single link DVI signal without any additional hardware, although it does so at a lower voltage. It uses a lower signaling voltage than HDMI. The net result of that is that a passive HDMI or a passive DVI adapter just has a small redriver chip in it to bump the voltages up and then does nothing else. An active adapter actually takes the full Displayport signal in and then has a chip that translates and retransmits the appropriate generation of HDMI or DVI based on the generation that it is. And the advantage here is that these active adapters typically allow you to plug in more panels. So especially when Eyefinity was a thing, and I've seen, you know, cards from NVIDIA that have 8 mini Displayports on them. You could plug HDMI panels into them. And that wasn't actually an uncommon use case if you were building things like video walls. You'd get slim bezeled televisions and you'd, you know, put 9 of them in a grid or 8 of them in a line and do things like that. But they'd be HDMI. TVs don't have DisplayPort, so you'd need adapters for that, but you would need to use active adapters because the card was only capable of turning so many of those ports into HDMI and doing the translation inside the graphics card on its own. So these active adapters allow for additional features. Common things that I used to see on the passive adapters, what they wouldn't do 4K, but they'd be fine at 1080, or, you know, if you went past 2 or 3 of them, you just couldn't plug any more monitors in. It didn't matter how they were connected because the adapters were utilizing all of the display resources. Whereas if your panels were all DisplayPort, or if you used active adapters, you could use all 4 video interfaces at a time. I believe this one is a passive adapter since it doesn't specify DisplayPort version or HDMI version. Active adapters tend to be a little bit bigger and a little bit more expensive. You can spend 10 or 20 bucks on a passive adapter, and active adapters, especially if they're supposed to be 4K capable, will cost upwards of 40. Although there are some slim active adapters I've seen from companies like Excel that help keep the size down as far as that's concerned. Alright, so I think I've rambled for about 30 minutes about DisplayPort and HDMI and some of the resolutions they're capable of. All of the charts that I used are publicly available. This is the Wikipedia charts on these, and I'm not going to say that they're 100% perfect. I mean, there's question marks here in DisplayPort 1.2, just because nobody's looked up what the maximum bandwidth is in the new standard. I'm sure that'll get updated when devices are shipping with that. As far as any monitors we've looked at, I'll include a link back to this video in reference if I say, hey, this panel has DisplayPort 1.4 and HDMI 2.0. which is probably the most common that you'll see today. 2.1 is new, and because 2.1 really isn't needed on the HDMI side unless you go to either HDR or an 8K TV, it's not worth the additional cost. Now, that said, I'm sure it and DisplayPort 2.0 will become ubiquitous within the next 3 or 4 years, and I'll have to do this all over again and talk about what's new and different and exciting. Anyway, all of that said, thank you for watching. I'd like to thank our patrons as well as anyone who uses our Amazon affiliate links to... it is people like that and things like that that help support Pocketables and help encourage videos like this one, where we don't have a specific product we're looking at. There will be a couple of links to things like Displayport adapters and some HDMI dongles that I showed here in the video in the description if anyone's looking to move things one way or the other. And if there's questions you have, please leave them in the comments below and we will respond or update this video as is appropriate. I'd also like to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. Finally, thank you for watching.